Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from lunch. I'm sorry I didn't get to join you. My name's Edith Jones. I'm a judge here in Houston, but a former UT grad myself. And very happy to be the moderator of this panel on conditions on federal spending following NFIB versus Sibelius. We have three excellent speakers here whom I could take half of our time introducing, but I'll try to give them short introductions and then move on into the panel. Professor Baker holds the Frederick Varian Chair in Law at University of Texas here. She's a leading academic defender of federalism and the rights of states. Professor Baker has published dozens of articles and book chapters. Her scholarship has been cited by numerous state and federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. Among her best-known publications on conditional spending are Conditional Federal Spending After Lopez, Getting Off the Dole, and How a Too Clever Congress Could Provoke It to Do So. The last of which was cited by Justice Ginsburg in the NFIB decision. She's a graduate of Yale College, Yale Law School, Oxford, and she attended Oxford as a Marshall Scholar. Professor Bagenstos, in the middle of the panel, is a professor in civil rights, public law, and litigation in Michigan, right? From 2009 to 11, he was a political appointee in the Department of Justice, the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. He promulgated the 2010 ADA regulations, the first comprehensive update since 1991, and helped to reinvigorate the Civil Rights Division enforcement of the Olmstead decision, which guarantees people with disabilities the right to live and receive services in the most integrated, appropriate setting. He's published articles in numerous law journals, and again, I could go on for a long time, but he was a visiting professor at UCLA, clerk for Judge Reinhardt, and served in the Department of Justice, clerk for Justice Ginsburg, and has his law degree from Harvard. At the end of the panel is Professor Michael Greve from George Mason University School of Law. From 2000 to 2012, he was the John Searle Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he remains a visiting scholar. For many years, he directed the Center for Individual Rights, a public interest law firm. Professor Greve holds an MA and a PhD from Cornell, completed his undergraduate studies at Hamburg, and is chair of the board of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's written on many different legal subjects and a number of books, most recently The Upside Down Constitution, another book called The Demise of Environmentalism in American Law, and Real Federalism, Why It Matters, How It Could Happen. He's also co-authored with Richard Epstein and with Michael Zeller. So without further ado, we'll hear first from Professor Baker, then Professor Bagenstos, then Professor Greve, and then we'll have questions and answers. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Judge, and I'm delighted to be here at a Federalist Society conference yet again. These are always such terrific events because of the diversity of viewpoints and the level of engagement of the audience, and it's always a treat to be invited to speak at these. Today in my remarks, I'm going to take up two questions, and then I'm going to pose two questions. And the two questions I'm going to take up are, first of all, what is the challenge that confronts modern spending power doctrine? And secondly, what is the court's spending power doctrine after NFIB? Prior to the Supreme Court's decisions beginning in 1992, which kicked off the so-called Federalist revival, there wasn't a lot of reason to care about the spending power. In a world in which Congress was understood to have virtually plenary power, regulatory power directly over the states, there was little reason to worry about any limits that might exist on more indirect regulatory power via conditional spending. The task for a modern spending power doctrine, however, is not so simple as, say, prohibiting any conditional offer of federal funds to the states, which, if accepted, might regulate the states in a way that Congress could not directly mandate. Since at least 1936 and U.S. against Butler, we have also understood that Congress's power to spend is greater. It is more expansive and broader than its power to regulate the states. At the same time, we cannot have a spending power doctrine that would simply allow Congress to spend and impose conditions in any way that it might choose on the simplistic ground that a state that doesn't like the offer can always simply turn it down. Such a doctrine would strip all meaning, I believe, from the Constitution's notion of a federal government of limited enumerated powers. So the problem, simply put, is this. How can one distinguish and invalidate those conditional offers of federal funds to the states that threaten to render meaningless the 10th Amendment and its notion of a federal government of limited powers, while at the same time affording Congress a power to spend for the general welfare that is greater than its power directly to regulate the states? Since 1987 in Dole, the court has provided us a doctrine, a controversial and highly imperfect doctrine, as a response to this problem. And until the last term in the court's decision in NFIB, this doctrine, the Dole doctrine, was thought to be essentially toothless, certainly with regard to the coercion prong of its test. Never before had the court invalidated any offer of federal funds to the states on the grounds that it was unconstitutionally coercive. In the NFIB decision, the court, while claiming to be applying the Dole doctrine and finally giving its coercion doctrine some bite, has also, I believe, left us with a substantially altered doctrine. So as most of you likely know, the spending power question raised in the NFIB against Sebelius case involved the Medicaid expansion provision of the Affordable Care Act, which would have increased the number and categories of individuals that participating states must cover. The act increased federal spending to cover some, but arguably not all, of the state's costs in expanding Medicaid coverage in the specified ways. If a state did not comply with the Act's new coverage requirements, critically, it would lose not only the federal funding for those new requirements, but all of its federal Medicaid funds. The 26 states and others who challenged the Act contended that this Medicaid expansion exceeded Congress's authority under the spending clause, and 7 justices across 2 opinions agreed. I'm going to refer to these 2 opinions as the Roberts Group, which includes Chief Justice Roberts and Justices Breyer and Kagan, and then we have these so-called joint dissenters who actually agree with the Roberts Group on this issue, which are Scalia, Kennedy, Thomas, and Alito. In reaching their decision in NFIB, both groups of justices claim to be applying the test set out in the court's 1987 decision in Dole. In fact, however, both opinions deviate significantly from that decision. At issue in Dole was a federal statute that famously withheld 5% of federal highway funds from any state that did not have a minimum drinking age of 21. In upholding the challenged statute, the Dole court held that the spending power is not unlimited and went on to set out 5 restrictions. 2 of those prongs of the 5-prong test played no role in the NFIB decision. The requirement that the spending power must be exercised in pursuit of the general welfare has long been viewed as essentially non-justiciable by the Supreme Court, and that did not change in NFIB. Similarly, the independent constitutional bar prong of the Dole test did not come into play in NFIB, and that's the restriction that precludes Congress from using the spending power to induce the states to engage in activities that would themselves be unconstitutional. It's when we get to the 3rd prong, the so-called clear notice or Pennhurst prong of the Dole test, that things begin to get interesting. The Roberts Group did invoke this provision in reaching its result. The joint dissenters did not. More critically, the Roberts Group, I believe, critically changed the meaning of this restriction from its historical meaning. Historically, this provision has sought to ensure that the terms of the conditional offer made to the state is clear at the time the state is asked to make the choice whether or not to accept the condition. Under that traditional understanding, the Medicaid Expansion Act would arguably pose no problem. The terms of the offer are clear. No state has contended that it doesn't know what its obligations would be if it accepted the deal, nor what the implications would be if it turned it down. The Roberts Group, however, read this provision in an entirely new way, I believe, such that the question becomes whether the states could have known at the time they agreed to participate in the original Medicaid plan that those funds might later be at risk unless additional conditions to be disclosed at some unknown point in the future were met. Thus stated, it seems clear to me that even the sort of obviously prospective condition presented by the Medicaid Expansion Act could be construed to be oddly retroactive and thus problematic. Thus interpreted, this provision would also now seem to pose a significant threat to any new condition on previously available funds, even if the condition is both clear and entirely prospective in its application. A fourth dole restriction was also seemingly relevant to the Roberts Group's decision, but again, not to the decision of the joint dissenters. And this is the so-called germaneness or relatedness requirement, that conditional offers of federal funds to the states must be related to the federal interest in particular national projects or programs. Historically, this provision has required, for example, has been read to require that a condition on the receipt of federal highway funds, for example, must be related in some fashion to a state's other decisions regarding highways and not, for example, instead to whether or not a state chooses to include the death penalty as part of its criminal laws. The conditions imposed by the Medicaid expansion are imposed on the receipt of Medicaid funds and would therefore seem quite clearly to be related to Medicaid and to the federal interests underlying that larger program. The Roberts Group, however, seemed to read this requirement to permit only modifications of Medicaid, defined somehow, and deemed the Medicaid expansion an attempt by Congress to foist, quote, an entirely new healthcare system upon the states. Now, it's the final requirement set out in Dole, the so-called anti-coercion prong, where the crux of the action turns out to be, primarily because this is the only prong of the Dole test that both the joint dissenters and the Roberts Group agreed that the Medicaid Expansion Act did not meet. In setting out this requirement, the Dole court noted that in some circumstances, the inducement offered by Congress through the conditional offer of funds might be so coercive as to pass the point at which pressure turns into compulsion. In Dole, you'll recall that the threatened loss to the states of 5% of their federal highway money was deemed not to cross this particular line. But the court indicated in Dole that it was not precluding the possibility that some other amount of funds so conditioned might in the future be found to cross that line. And the Roberts Group determined that, in fact, the Medicaid Expansion Act did cross that line. And indeed, they termed this offer a gun to the head. They noted that a state that did not comply with the new conditions would lose not merely a relatively small percentage of their existing Medicaid funding, but all of it. They further noted that the Medicaid funds at issue amounted to 10% of a state's overall budget. The Roberts Group explicitly did not fix the precise line where they believe persuasion gives way to coercion, but they did conclude that wherever that line might be, the Medicaid Expansion Act was surely beyond it. Now, the joint dissenters agreed with the Roberts Group on all these points. They noted that the federal Medicaid expenditures are nearly 22% of all state expenditures. whereas the funds at issue in Dole amounted to only 0.2% of all state expenditures. A critical difference, however, and a problematic critical difference, I believe, between the Roberts Group and the joint dissenters is that the entire analysis of the joint dissenters focused on this anti-coercion principle. They paid lip service to the other four Dole requirements, but did not invoke any of them en route to invalidating the Expansion Act. It is not clear to me that Dole can sensibly be read to invalidate legislation that fails only the anti-coercion prong of the five-prong test. And in any event, the opinion offered by the joint dissenters standing alone does not, I think, provide any sort of judicially manageable reading of Dole. Presumably, the joint dissenters do not mean to say that it is problematic if the federal government offers the states a great deal of money with any conditions at all attached. Presumably, it must matter to them what those conditions are. Presumably, Congress must be allowed to fix at least some of the conditions on federal money that it offers the states. But the joint dissenters provide no particular elaboration on that point. And so where we are left at the end of their decision is with the possibility that the best way to understand at least their portion of this NFIB decision on spending is that they have begun crafting for us, along with perhaps the Roberts Group, a kind of freestanding fiscal anti-commandeering principle whose details would remain to be worked out in future cases. So here are my two questions for us to discuss, perhaps here going forward. In any event, these are two questions that keep me awake at night, which reflects, I'm sure, poorly on the rest of my life. In any event, the sorts of things that I worry about, there are two, primarily, and here's the first. Does the spending power doctrine after NFIB, as interpreted by the Roberts Group, and in particular the joint dissenters, would it prohibit the federal government from offering each state a grant equal to that state's current annual expenditures for primary and secondary education without any conditions attached other than that the money be spent for primary and secondary education? Now in Texas, just to give you a sense of the enormity of these funds, in Texas in 2012, this was 44% of total state general revenue expenditures, primary and secondary education. I'm not at all certain that the joint dissenters would find this offer coercive or otherwise problematic, and I think Sam Bagenstos may end up disagreeing with me here. The joint dissenters' own example along these lines, notably, in their opinion, included a variety of conditions on the federal education offer. Conditions governing curricula, the hiring and firing of teachers, and so on. And their concern was they did not want Congress to be left, rightly, to dictate policy, quote, in areas traditionally governed primarily at the state or local level. It was arguably those conditions, together with the size of the offer, that rendered the hypothetical grant problematic for the joint dissenters. But we'll see. Now my second question is this, and it's one asked by Justice Ginsburg in her opinion. Could Congress going forward simply take the repeal and reenact route? Whatever that might look like, could Congress avoid a concern that spending in one program is being conditioned on participation by the state in a second new program simply by simultaneously even repealing the old program and reenacting, perhaps even in the same bill, the combined program? In this case, that would leave us with a single Medicaid program that would combine the Expansion Act's components with the old Medicaid components. And the question would then be, would that one-time, brand new, seemingly brand new proposal, would this in any way violate the spending power doctrine as understood now by the joint dissenters and the Roberts Group. Ginsburg posed this question in the decision, and the Roberts Group offered a very indirect response to the argument, noting that, well, that would never really happen, basically. That practical constraints, they said, quote, would plainly inhibit putting every feature of Medicaid on the table for political reconsideration, which of course wouldn't necessarily happen if we were doing this simultaneously. The joint dissenters had no response to this particular question. So I will now leave you with these two questions. As for where we go from here, I hope our fellow panelists, my fellow panelists, will now tell us. Thank you.
Well, so now this is my second spending clause panel in a row following Lynn Baker, and I didn't do well the last time following Lynn Baker. She's a very tough act to follow, and I'm sure that she'll be a tough act to follow again. I do want to say, just at the beginning, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group. As Judge Jones's introduction suggests, you know, Reinhardt, clerk, Obama administration, political appointee. I have, and what you didn't say is, you know, proud graduate of the University of North Carolina. As such, I feel sometimes I've come to a lot of Federalist Society events, and I always enjoy the give and take and always enjoy the welcome I get, but I always feel a little bit like my beloved Tar Heels walking into Cameron Indoor Stadium going to these events, and so I appreciate the opportunity to come here. At least you're not sticking out your hands at me like they do. So thank you. And I also think that this is just such a great opportunity to have a discussion, not only with the folks in the audience, but also with the folks on the panel whose work on these issues, while I may have my disagreements with, I have learned just so much from through the years, and I'll talk some about a little bit of their work and while I go through, but obviously Lynn's article on conditional spending after Lopez kind of sets the entire agenda for this field, and Mike's recent book, The Upside Down Constitution, you know, has this very interesting, I have a reaction that I find interesting, which is I completely disagree with nearly every normative premise behind the book, and yet every page I found fascinating and felt like I was learning something from it. So I thought that was really terrific, and it has a lot to say about these topics, and I think a lot that people who are coming to these topics anew or who have thought about them for a long time really can learn from. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk here. This conference is about the Federal Leviathan, right? That's in the title of this conference, the Federal Leviathan. And one agenda that a lot of folks have had for a long time has been, how do we tame this Federal Leviathan? And I want to take as a given that there's a Federal Leviathan for these purposes, and that there ought to be an agenda to tame it. That's a subject of some normative debate, but I want to take that as a given for a second. Now, conditional federal spending has been one of the significant arenas for decades now in efforts to tame the Federal Leviathan. For people who are concerned about the size and the scope of the federal government, conditional federal spending has been a major target for a long time now, and I think there are a couple of reasons for it. One is, and I think this ties very much into Lynn's conditional spending after Lopez article, as the Supreme Court narrowed congressional power to regulate private primary conduct and state conduct in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, the conditional spending looked like a way Congress might be able to circumvent those limitations, and certainly you saw efforts very quickly after many of the limiting decisions issued by the Supreme Court, efforts in Congress to use conditional spending, to rely on the vast amount of federal spending going to the states, attaching conditions to that federal spending to try, in effect, to override or circumvent the Supreme Court's decisions in cases like Lopez, in sovereign immunity cases, for example. So one significant reason why we're looking at conditional spending is it looked like the last thing left for Congress, and it looked like if the Supreme Court really had an agenda of trying to close off what the court might have considered to be overriding, overweening, or overextensive federal power, that it had to look to conditional spending. But there's a longer and more pre-existing trend here, and that trend is the growth over many, many decades, beginning with the New Deal, with some drop in the 1980s, but then returning after that, of conditional federal spending to the states, of federal grants to the states, with big political coalitions that might be sort of politically surprising coalitions, including a lot of governors, including a lot of conservative Republican governors, saying, yes, 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 money with conditions is good for me, I want it, please give me more. And so if you're concerned, and I think one of the things that Mike's book does so well is showing from a political economy perspective how this happens, and how looking at it from a systems perspective, you see how this has occurred, and why this, if you're concerned about the size, the scope, and the extent of the federal government, why this might be a problem. So, conditional spending is a target. Now, lots of scholarly effort was devoted in the 80s, the 90s, the aughts, to trying to articulate a constitutional or legal basis for the courts, including the Supreme Court, to try to limit Congress's conditional federal spending power. And there were hints during this time that the jurisprudence might move in that direction, particularly with the aggressive expansion of the notice requirement, which Lynn has talked about what the court did, expanding it even further in the NFIB case, or at least Chief Justice Roberts in the NFIB case, expanding it even further. But this sort of aggressive use of the notice requirement to try to at least trim more and more significantly what Congress was doing or could do in the conditional spending area, and hints by a number of individual justices, lower court judges, that perhaps more was in the offing. In this context, the spending clause holding of the NFIB case looks like it ought to be a big deal. It looks like it ought to be, this is the taming of the federal Leviathan, of this aspect of the federal Leviathan that people have been waiting for. It is the very first time that the Supreme Court has ever held a spending condition unconstitutional because it coerces the states. You may think of the Butler case we all studied in constitutional law, held a spending condition unconstitutional as coercive, but coercive of the farmers, of the individual farmers. This is the first case in which the court has held a spending condition coercive of the states, and therefore unconstitutional, exceeding Congress's spending power. The coercion doctrine itself, was just a hint in a couple of cases before this. Stewart Machine, Chief Justice Cardozo kind of throws off well, there might be a point where this moves into compulsion. There might be a point, but we don't have to decide it here. Chief Justice Rehnquist in the Dole case, again, in articulating coercion as a potential limitation on Congress's conditional spending power, actually treats it as something a little different than the others. He says there are 4 limitations. And then there might be a point where, again, this turns into compulsion. We don't have to decide it here. Clearly, this is well within the inducement, not compulsion side. Okay, so it's just a hint up until that point. It's just a suggestion. There's no holding. And the Supreme Court says this is, in NFIB, coercion of the states. Should be a big deal. So how much does NFIB tame the federal Leviathan? I would say not very much. I would say NFIB, by its holding, does not tame the federal Leviathan that much. And you've heard from Lynn about this. I don't want to talk a lot about kind of how I would parse the various opinions. I think I basically agree with how Lynn would read the opinions. Let me just say I've made an article I have coming out in a month or so in the Georgetown Law Journal, that the Chief Justice's pivotal opinion renders the spending condition coercive only in very narrow circumstances, where Congress takes what's first a very large, second pre-existing conditional spending program, and third tells a state that if you want to continue participating in that program, you have to also agree to participate in this entirely separate and distinct program. And in those circumstances, there is coercion. And in the context of Medicaid, which is the largest conditional spending program by far to the states, by an order of magnitude to the states, actually by 2 orders of magnitude, I think, to the states. In the context of Medicaid itself, there's a powerful argument there. And we can have our quibbles. I have some quibbles in this article I have forthcoming with how the Chief Justice applied this principle to the NFIB case itself, but at least you see how it works in the context of Medicaid. But I think any reading of the opinion as imposing more significant limitations on Congress's conditional spending power is inconsistent both with what Chief Justice Roberts said he was holding and what his reasoning was in his pivotal opinion, but also with the constitutional principles that he says drive him, constitutional principles of accountability on the one hand, and of ensuring that the current Congress can continue to tailor and mold and shift spending programs in accordance with its view of what the general welfare is. Okay, so I don't think there's much taming going on here. I think that this decision really limits Congress in only a very narrow set of situations. And I'd like to argue for the rest of my time that that's a good thing. And so here's the point where, you know, I might start to see some of the Cameron crazies come out, and that's okay. And so it's a good thing for a number of reasons. First of all, I want to note that coercion, in the sense that the NFIB joint dissent uses it, is really not the right concept here. So the idea that states have a will that's overborne by large offers of federal money, it raises serious conceptual problems. It's problems we've known about for a long time. What's the difference between an offer that is too good to refuse and an offer that you can't refuse, right? I can't do my Marlon Brando, but you know how Marlon Brando said it. And you know, since Cardozo, talking about how this kind of inquiry plunges us into endless difficulties, we've understood the conceptual problems with saying that by offering you too much money, you have been coerced. As an empirical matter, in addition, this is not how conditional spending laws actually work. Number one, at least over the past period of time, Mike's book has some suggestions, has a nice suggestive chart that this might change in the future, but at least in the past, federal taxation and federal conditional spending have not crowded out the state's ability to raise its own revenues, and this is an area where Lynn and I have had some discussion. I'm sure we'll have more. As states, and moreover, states and state officials are very much at the table in developing conditional federal spending packages. This is in part why, the other reason being that states can always say no, and so the federal government has to pay enough to overcome the state's holdout price, essentially. This is why the matches to states, the inducements to states tend to be so generous. In the context of Medicaid itself, every state gets at least half of its expenses reimbursed. Many states get much more than half of their expenses reimbursed. In the context of the Medicaid expansion that was before the court in NFIB, the additional increment of expansion population would be paid for 100% by the federal government for the first couple of years, dropping to 90% by the end of the decade. Very generous terms for the states. States and state officials might not like particular conditions, but they're parts of a package that results from a negotiation between state officials and federal officials in which state officials have substantial leverage and involvement. So the idea that what's going on here is coercion in the sense of overbearing a will, which is sometimes the way you read it, often the way it's expressed in some of these opinions, I don't think that really works. And I think that's why the most sophisticated challenges critiques of conditional spending, like Lynn's and Mike's, which are different from each other, they're the same in the sense that they focus on its homogenizing effects, its effects in limiting interstate competition. But even here, let me just say a couple of things in favor of conditional spending. First of all, often the alternative to conditional spending is not that the government, that this is devolved to the states, whatever issue it is, or there's less government involvement in general. Often, the alternative is complete nationalization. If you think about healthcare, the subject of NFIB, it would be remarkably easy for Congress when it was setting up, not leaving the politics aside, remarkably easy administratively for Congress when it was setting up Medicaid, when Lyndon Johnson, who's building her shrine we are right now, was setting up Medicaid. It would have been remarkably easy administratively to say, let's do this entirely as a national program, as a federal program. Medicaid is an insurance program. That's all it is, right? It would be very easy to have HHS do it. They wouldn't even have to have HHS people in Washington do it. They can have offices everywhere. They do have offices everywhere. And you see, even in the context of the Affordable Care Act's exchanges, when the states have not participated in exchanges, set up exchanges, the federal government has set up those exchanges. Congress, in the architecture of the Affordable Care Act, said, look, you do it or we'll do it. We can do it cooperatively, or we'll do it nationally. Lots of arguments about what that means as far as the law goes, but as far as the alternative of state versus federal, or cooperative versus federal, if there's no cooperative, it's going to be simply federal. So if that's right, so I'm running low on time. So if that's right, then the question is, what are we buying? What's good? The question for me is, what's good about having the states involved in a conditional spending program? And I think that what's good about having the states involved is actually a lot of stuff that a lot of folks who care about federalism should care about. What's good is there's an opportunity in the administration of the program for states to make substantial molding of the program to their local conditions through the negotiation of waivers and such, which have grown up exponentially since the Clinton administration in particular, and the Bush administration continued, the Obama administration has continued it. There's an opportunity for quite substantial tailoring of federal, state, cooperative programs to local conditions, whether they're factual conditions or different local values. And that's important, and that's something that you wouldn't get if you just had nationalization. Now, of course, there are times when the alternative isn't nationalization. In these cases, if you're really against policy that takes place pursuant to federal direction and paid for by federal revenues, you're not going to like conditional spending. But I wouldn't join you in that opposition. I'd say because of collective action dynamics among states, there are lots of very worthy objects of government that can't be achieved without a strong federal policy and financial role. And that's true even if people all over the country want, all else equal, for their states to achieve those objects. I think about Medicaid, but of course I also think about the Interstate Highway Act, Elementary and Secondary Education Act. All these statutes have problems, but I would submit that they're all quite successful in significant ways, and none could happen without a strong policy and financial role. You might disagree. I suspect a lot of you do. But that to me highlights the problems with imposing some sort of judicial effort to tame Leviathan here. Because these sorts of disagreements, I would say, are the stuff of democratic politics. One person's race to the bottom, maybe my race to the bottom, is another's interjurisdictional competition. One person's effort to avoid collective action problems or to adopt universal entitlements of national citizenship is another's cartel. There's no way to resolve these questions without making very contestable normative judgments about what the proper object of government is, what our nation is supposed to be about, what citizenship as an American is supposed to be about. And we can't resolve these questions also without making highly contestable empirical judgments. I would submit, with all the problems of our national political process, and boy, I could talk for 15, 20 minutes about that, but I'm not going to. I've learned, Judge Jones probably doesn't remember, I've appeared in front of her and I've learned not to cross Judge Jones. Still, the political process of debate, of argumentation, of deliberation, of pulling, hauling, and trading, to me is superior to a process of judicial fiat for resolving these questions. And so, I would argue that what the court did in the NFIB case, by not aggressively taming the Leviathan of conditional spending, was a good thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to commend Sam's article to you. It's already on SSRN, the one that's going to be in the Georgetown Law Journal. There are, and I want to say I agree almost entirely with the article. There are two arguments or 2 points in particular that I agree with. One is Sam says maybe you can sort of extract some anti-leveraging rule from the NFIB opinions, that is to say, the Congress cannot use funds to leverage programs in entirely unrelated areas in some sense. But if that's so, that'll probably be a one-trick pony because, as Sam just said, there's no other statute that comes even close to Medicaid in terms of its size, and those things matter in the court's opinion. And the second thing is, he says, the principal effect of the NFIB decision has been to increase the state's bargaining power vis-a-vis the federal government in Medicaid in particular. I believe that's right. The state governors have said that, and they have acted on it. I myself am not sure that that's a good thing, but in any event, that's not a sea change in the conditional spending arena. So I want to commend this article to you, and in particular I want to commend it to you because it tries to take the opinion seriously. I myself have never managed to play it for anything but laughs. So I want to, instead of going over that opinion yet again, I want to take a step back and, as it were, critique the conservative critique of cooperative federalism programs. My reason for doing that is that I believe that most conservatives have no clue as to what's wrong with these programs, and that is true at a constitutional and at a political level. So the problem with conditional spending programs supposedly is coercion. Now, we can't be talking about literal coercion on the part of the federal government. That's already unconstitutional because it's called commandeering. So we're talking about something that's a little more subtle and metaphorical, something more like duress. But I think there's no coherent constitutional theory of duress, and I think even if there were, I wouldn't put much hope in it because it would miss the political economy of these programs entirely. So let me give you 3 examples of the kinds of things that I have in mind. First is this: the NFIB case itself was won and argued on coercion, the proverbial gun to the head. Presumably the decision removed the gun to the head. And now that the gun is gone, the victims, the supposed victims, are making a beeline for the money. That result was altogether predictable, and we could have had it without all the commotion. That's the second point. Why is it predictable? And the answer is that Medicaid has grown by leaps and bounds over the decades, not because the feds require it, but because states demand it. The way the program works is there are some services and populations that you have to cover as a state under the program, so those are mandatory, but there are also optional services. And if you cost this out, well over 60% of all Medicaid spending is optional. This is not something that the federal government forced on the states. Third example is this. In the 80s and 90s, there was, as both of you speakers here indicated, a vibrant conservative debate over these programs, over unfunded mandates. I remember it all too well, which goes to show that I'm getting old and listen to too much Taylor Swift. The argument then was that what's wrong here, what's coercive, is that the feds sort of toss a few dollars into the street and then they refuse to pay the full price for the conditions, for the implementation of the conditions that come along with these programs, with the money. There was a lot of conservative agitation over it. It was the Unfunded Mandate Reform Act, and there was a lot of demand to make the grant conditions more favorable, less coercive. And note that the NFIB argument was exactly the opposite. Medicaid is too generous because it pays 100%. And one of the justices asked Paul Clement, Counselor, I mean, if they paid 120%, would it be yet more coercive? And he had to say yes. And so which is it to be? Maybe there's some Goldilocks theory of federalism and adequate funding out there. But I think it's more likely that one of the coercion arguments at least is wrong, and I think it's still more likely that both are wrong, because the pathologies of spending statutes have nothing to do whatsoever with coercion. They have to do with very bad incentives. I'll group these incentives under 4 headings: fiscal illusions, fiscal asymmetry, time inconsistency, and lock-in effects. Let me take them one at a time. What I mean by fiscal illusion is that conditional funding programs are a systematic effort to exploit voter ignorance for the purpose of making government services look much cheaper than they are, and in that fashion to increase the demand for those programs. Let's start with a few ballpark numbers on Medicaid. Even before Obamacare, that was the biggest and most generous federal transfer program. It's about $275 billion a year, 45% of all federal funding. You have to add sort of another 180 billion or so in state spending, so now you're over 450 billion a year. The program is close to 25% of all state spending, much more in some states. It's projected to grow at 9% over years, with or without Obamacare. That means it will double in less than a decade. And then you ask yourself, would any state lock itself into that commitment if it had to pay the full price? I think the answer to that is no. Would the federal government sustain Medicaid at those levels? I think the answer is it would never have gotten to this level. It is precisely because of the joint funding that Medicaid has become so big and so fast growing. At the federal level, Medicaid looks comparatively cheap because, hey, for every dollar we spend, we get, well, not exactly $2, but close to $2 of services. So that, hey, that looks like a bargain. And the state level Medicaid expansion also looks cheaper than any other program. In other words, the federal grants spur the local demand for taxes and spending, and that is the intended result of these programs. What the state voters in all of this ignore is that they're also paying for the federal portion. That is not as stupid as it sounds, because Medicaid, from their vantage, is just, you know, another claim on a common pool, and you can't trace the effects on your federal tax rate. But what happens is you end up with a level of spending that no jurisdiction would ever choose on its own. And that is the point of configuring the program that way. It's a very nasty, ruinous political MO, but it's not unconstitutional for the government to create fiscal illusions. If that were so, there'd be no government. The second point, fiscal asymmetry. All the governors, the Republican governors who now caved into Obamacare said the same thing. We can't simply leave the money on the table, because our taxpayers will pay their share, quote unquote, of the federal program either way, so we can only opt out of the benefits but never the costs of the program. And that's a potent strand of the coercion argument. The way the argument goes is, well, feds here act like a pickpocket who first steals your wallet and then promises to give it back on condition that you cooperate in some scheme of his. That's suggested, for example, in Paul Clement's briefs in these cases. The argument, I think, has some plausibility, but again, it's a problem of incentives and not coercion. Look, the feds don't tax states at all. They tax individuals. And the states can't interpose in that relation. The receipts then go not to individuals, but to the states. And government actors at all levels exploit the asymmetry, but the pickpocket analogy nonetheless fails because the money wasn't taken from the folks to whom it's then given back, or given conditionally. So the problem you have is there's nothing wrong with either leg of this transaction, so you can't, I think, get a constitutional handle on the problem that way. The third thing, time inconsistency. State officials who agree to conditional funding programs often know that these programs or the expansions will require very substantial tax effort in years ahead, and they may wreck state budgets. So why do they agree? The answer is because state officials have the time horizon of a mole. They think to the next election and no further, and the wreckage down the road is somebody else's problem. So the problem with these programs is not that state officials can't say no, it's that they don't want to say no. State officials sort of constricted time horizon, that's actually a constitutional problem. As Alexander Hamilton said in Federalist 1, all these state officials look to is the power, emolument, and consequence of their offices. They don't have any encompassing interest, and Hamilton's conclusion was that you couldn't build a constitution with state officials, you would have to simply beat these people. And for some reason, modern-day conservatives want to empower them. How that would improve the situations, I don't really know. The last sort of incentive effect I want to talk about is the lock-in effect. When Rick Scott, Governor Scott, the state's ringleader in the anti-ACA litigation, agreed to the Medicaid expansion a few days ago, he said, well, I'll only do this so long as the feds pay 100%, and then I'll do it only for 3 years. Well, great. This is not going to work, if I have to say that, because federal programs, once in place, grow ineluctably, because every expansion looks relatively cheap and every cutback looks idiotically expensive, because to save a single dollar in state revenue, you have to cut $2 or $3 or $4 worth of Medicaid. And that's particularly unlikely to happen because over time, these funds have a flypaper effect, as the economists say. The money sticks where it hits, meaning with state governments and their clients. So education funding doesn't fund education, it funds educators. And Medicaid funding doesn't fund the poor, because if we wanted to do that, we'd give them the money. It funds the providers and the nurses unions, and so on and on. And so once you strip the NFIB plaintiffs' arguments of the burble, what comes down to is, look, we, state officials, have an inalienable right to build up our own political constituencies with federal dollars at our own chosen speed. I don't think that's plausible. My point is not so much that the NFIB arguments are laughable, although that's true. The point is, I can't think of any coercion argument or theory that goes anywhere near any of these perverse incentives that drive the programs. So the key problem, to say this simply, is that very clearly the Constitution permits the federal government to give states money that they haven't raised. And very clearly the states may accept that money. So in combination, these entitlements allow government actors to collude for the purpose of overexploiting the tax base. But it's not coercion that's the problem, it's the constitutional entitlements themselves, the power to spend and the power to accept the money. And once you see it that way and you look at it that way, the painful reality is the Supreme Court can't do anything about it. The solution would have to be political. Unfortunately, the political agenda has also been affected by the coercion virus. The mantra is, let's block grant these programs so that they're more acceptable for states. I think that's a dumb idea for three reasons. One is, it'll make the programs vastly more expensive. I'd be happy to explain, the slightest provocation why that is. Second, more freedom for the states means more freedom to dissipate the funds to favored constituencies, in particular unionized constituencies. Why that is a plausible conservative program, I will never understand. And the third thing is that the block grants still don't come to grips with the real problem, which is that so long as states get to spend money they haven't raised, you'll get rotten incentives and strategic behaviors on all sides. So what would fix the problem? Well, a number of things. You could either abolish Medicaid. That is not going to happen. You could, as Sam suggested, you could nationalize the program and run it directly from Washington, but that might not be very effective, but at least it wouldn't grow on autopilot anymore. You could nationalize the program and cash it out to individuals. The late Senator Moynihan had a famous, when he sort of looked at these programs, like to say, well, if we want to redistribute income, I have an idea. Let's redistribute income. The idea is give money to people, not to places or to politicians. And the third thing you could do is you could try to realign the incentives. So Medicaid is now about 8-9% of all federal spending. You could pass a law or a Medicaid amendment or whatever, providing that for a state that doesn't participate in Medicaid, the state's taxpayers, not the states, but the individual taxpayers, get an 8 or 9% refund on their income tax. What I think that would do is it would actually get at the heart of what is now called coercion. At a minimum, it would generate a somewhat more honest debate at the state level. And if implemented, it might actually do something to sort of curb the intergovernmental bureaucracies that tend to grow up around these programs. I'd be happy to entertain any of these proposals or any proposals that go into that direction, but my main point is coercion is a distraction. Thank you.
I
Coleman and president of the Austin Lawyers chapter, and I'm a graduate of Harvard, where Professor Bagenstos was one of my professors. And I've been waiting 12 years to ask him this question. Actually, I have it for civil rights litigation, and this is unrelated. Well, it's a little related. Professor Bagenstos, as a conservative, I have some sympathy with your idea that certain things should be left primarily to the political process to determine what our response will be politically and whether that response will be at the national or the state level. But I think our experience has been that without judicial articulation of limits on federal power, the political give and take is pretty one-sided, with the federal government taking whatever power it's allowed to take. So isn't there a role for judicial articulation of the limits of federal power under our constitutional structure? And isn't it possible that more, better, and clearer and further judicial articulation of those limits would help that political power? I think a good example is the passage of Obamacare. If you go politically, if you go by the polls at the time it was passed and the election that occurred right after that, the public politically was saying, we do not want this nationally done. Texas and several other states, qua states, are still of the opinion that it shouldn't have been done, but it was done anyway, and it's been upheld.
So I think that's a great question. I will say, though, I mean, you're being a little disingenuous because stripped of Obamacare, you did ask me this question 12 years ago. I remember that. It was a very useful. I love that. Was my favorite year of teaching that class because we had such an interesting diversity of views among the students. And I will say a couple of things about that. I mean, first of all, I want to make clear that what I'm saying is having some judicial rule limiting the ability to put conditions on federal spending is problematic, and probably not something that courts ought to do, at least beyond the very kind of extreme case that the Chief Justice dealt with in NFIB. I'm not making an argument generally that courts should stay out of policing the line between federal and state roles, or policing the federal-state balance, or however you want, whatever metaphor you like here, spheres, balance, whatever. It's not an argument about that. I mean, it's very much an argument about when courts are making decisions, they have to make decisions that are the kind of decisions that courts can make without embarrassment. And I think a court can't make without embarrassment a decision that an offer of funds to a state is so generous as to be coercive. I think and I've already started laughter to the person next to me. I think it requires such a determination of what are highly contestable, highly divided issues in our American politics, that it's the kind of question. This kind of question, what is coercion, is the kind of question that I think is not very well dealt with by courts in the ordinary run of cases. Now, there might be lots of other places that you want to have courts making decisions that the federal structure has been somehow transgressed inappropriately. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, so Lynn and my friend Ernie Young have written a lot about, I have a nice paper about that. The question is what those rules ought to be, and I think this kind of rule is not a good one. I think the political process is a better place to deal with this kind of question.
Hi, Professor Greve, quick question. Regarding your proposal, which I found quite interesting, on an idea to get a lower tax rate for people in states which do not take the federal money, would there be any constitutional concerns raised regarding direct capitation in this regard?
I thought you were going to ask about the uniformity clause. right, which you could argue. To be blunt, I mean, I can't sit here and say, I've really thought carefully about this. This was more like, you know, it's a trial balloon, for Pete's sakes, right? I think it would pass muster. Right, and I'm pretty confident you could find examples like that in our tax history. Am I totally confident about that? No. But again, I mean, my main purpose was to sort of get at least, look, the argument that who would be leaving money on the table, right, was very prominent in NFIB. It was even more aggressively peddled in some of the briefs, and I was just trying to explain, if you really thought that was a problem, then the holding is not the remedy. You'd have to do, in terms of the incentive, something like this.
So one of the great public policy challenges for state governments is their state public pensions, that a lot of states have overextended themselves drastically. So one of the panel wanted to address how federal additional spending can be used to achieve various public policy goals without the states that have so poorly mismanaged their public pensions from just simply looting it in order to keep those pensions going.
Here's my sort of 2-minute or 3-minute riff on this. In a very real sense, I believe that the unfunded pension liabilities and other benefits, which now stand at upward of $4 trillion, are a consequence of federal conditional funding statutes. The way I would think about it is, you have this bizarre combination in American politics now of relatively hard budget constraints at the state level and almost non-existent budget constraints at the federal level. And so the money flows, you know, from, and states don't want to give up on the federal receipts and the federal funds. At the same time, they operate under balanced budget amendments and so forth. Where do they hide the shortfalls? Answer, and they, by, you know, underfunding the pension accounts. I am extremely worried about this in the long run, because as one of my banker friends says, debts that cannot be paid will not be paid. And in a lot of states, these pension funding, these pension obligations will not be payable by the states. And then the question is, what happens then? There will be, I believe, over the next few years, increased demands for federal bailouts of these funds. The first one is Obamacare, because what it allows states to do, or what it will allow states to do, is to transfer a lot of their healthcare obligations and people onto the federal accounts and subsidies and all the rest of it. That is why a lot of the states were for Obamacare before some of them were against it. And the other thing that may happen is that conditional funding programs offer vehicles to bail out state pension funds, right? They're not the only vehicle. The biggest vehicle we probably have is financial repression by the Fed. Something along the lines of, hey, you know, Mr. Diamond, perfectly fine bank you have there. It really looks nice. I'd hate to see anything bad happen to it. Why don't you buy some Illinois bonds? Right? But you could also see something along the lines of a, you know, teacher-oriented bailout. And the argument is we're committed to leaving no child left behind. That requires quality teachers. We can't have quality teachers if they're uncertain about their pensions. Therefore, we'll pass a pension amendment to, you know, the NCLV or some other federal statute. The sky is the limit. It's one of, I mean, if you look at other countries in particular, one of the problems of these programs is that they induce irresponsible state bets on federal de facto bailouts. We're already there in one of the future fights over fiscal federalism, or whatever you want to call it, is how is that stuff going to shake out? And again, coercion ain't it. It's where's the money coming from?
Let me just, may I just
interject one little defense of coercion here? Everyone's dumping on it as a theory, but Mr. Bagenstos actually appeared before me in court in a case that had to do with Rehabilitation Act or ADA as implemented through the Rehabilitation Act on behalf of people, and I don't think that I'm against the disabled, but it had to do with requiring curb cuts throughout an entire small town in Texas. And so the people in wheelchairs could travel around the town more easily. Well, why was this claim made? Because federal money was going into the town, and therefore you have to abide by the Rehabilitation Act as interpreted by the government, which means that every town in Texas, if they followed our ruling, we're going to spend $1 billion or more doing curb cuts. This case came down around 2009 or so, and most, even Texas was not having economic high times at that moment. And so what happens is that the federal control does in fact coerce the states to spend money in ways that they wouldn't the taxpayers would not otherwise allow. Yes, there's too much money being spent at all levels. Yes, the people who spend other people's money are not responsible with it, but it's sort of a parallel problem with the idea that the states are spending money that they don't have to tax their citizens for. The feds are imposing regulations that cost them nothing, but cost the states a lot of money. Next question.
Hi, Lynn from Stanford Law School. I wanted to take up Professor Baker's question, I guess, that keeps you up at night. The Ginsburg challenge that if they can just repass Medicare, then Medicaid knows the point. So my question to you is, could one answer to that be to create a constitutionally enforceable rule whereby the federal government cannot do indirectly what it does not have the power to do directly? So in the case of NFIB, yeah, sure, Congress, I mean, if you buy the Commerce Clause argument, which I don't, but let's say we do, that Congress has the power to do Medicaid under the Commerce Clause, then yeah, sure, if it can enact it directly, let it instead give it to the state's money and decide how to do it. But it can't, it does not have the power to tell, to directly have speed limits on highways. So South Dakota v. Dole's also wrongly decided. It can't enforce a national curriculum, so President Obama's Race to the Top program is also unconstitutional. Wouldn't that be a judicially enforceable rule with clear, I guess, limits, and that's also easily understandable?
If I'm understanding your question, you're suggesting that there's no difference between Congress's direct regulatory power, or we might have a rule that had entirely coextensive the spending power and regulatory power. Is that correct? I think that's certainly theoretically possible. I don't think that's the current state of American jurisprudence, for better or worse. Someone else here might disagree with me, but I think the reason why we have a problem now is, or something that merits the deep thinking of intelligent people, is precisely because we've created a gap. Our jurisprudence has, for many, many decades now, created a gap between the ability to spend and limits on that versus limits on the regulatory power. So would I personally favor something that precisely coextensive? I'm not sure. I think personally probably not, even though in general I'm very concerned about conditional federal spending. But
Council, to my mind, I mean, there's enough. It has a sort of certain surface attraction, but there are several problems and at several different levels, I think. So the first one is that, as we all know, there's no spending clause, right? There's only a taxing clause, and we know that the power to tax is broader than the power to regulate, right? So, and if that's true, and if you infer the spending power from the taxing power, presumably it follows that the spending power is broader than the taxing power, right? That's one problem. The other problem is that there are lots of situations where it's not a problem of, or not a question of doing indirectly what you can't do directly. Especially if you live in a sort of dual federalism world, right? there are lots of things where you have to allow intergovernmental bargains because the project cannot be accomplished by one government actor alone, right? And then the question is, what are the permissible terms of the bargains? And right, we have several rules that are addressed to dealing with that problem. So the clear statement rule has come up repeatedly. That is a rule that's targeted to curb the bargaining problems. Because what it says is that, well, the bargains may be good or bad, but the loss of transparency and accountability is a given for each of those bargains, and therefore we want to make sure that you were clear at the front end, as clear at least as you could be. That's an example, right? But I'm not sure that so if you can't do indirectly what you can't do directly, that helps you very far in a lot of these situations.
If the Constitution were amended to prohibit the federal government from giving free federal money to other governments, what would we lose and what would we gain?
The question is, what do you want, right? And so if the I tried to suggest, I mean, one thing you might have happen is it really depends on, you know, it depends on what the federal government is giving states money for right now and what they could do by themselves. One thing you might have happen is a lot more federalization, a lot more nationalization of the projects. And I think it's an interesting point in the joint dissent in NFIB, none of us have talked about, where the joint dissenters say, yes, we accept that given the Hamiltonian understanding of the spending power, a lot of stuff that Congress is now giving money to the states to do, Congress could do itself, or the federal government could do itself. Congress could decide to leave in federal government, but the joint dissenters say they probably won't do that. And so we're raising the cost, essentially, of having big government if we limit the ability of the federal government to give money to the states. And maybe it raises the cost, and the question is whether that leads to less government or more efficient government. And I think that's very much an empirical question that depends on what it is that the federal government is spending money on right now. So I don't think there's any way to answer in the abstract what would happen in a world like that.
It's also the constitutional question you have to ask yourself and wonder about, and it's also a political economy question. Congress can hire all sorts of outfits to do its bidding, quote unquote, right? It hires Boeing to build aircraft, right? It hires military contractors, lots of, hospitals to provide services, on and on and on. Why can't it, sort of, quote unquote, hire states and locals on the same basis? There may be an answer, but that's the way I would go about answering it.
I'm Mike Doherty. I'm a member of the Federalist Society, but I am not a lawyer. I'm the CEO of a medical laboratory. So I too lose sleep at night a lot listening to some of these discussions, because what we do is molecular testing of chromosomes for cancer propensity or tumor markers or pathology analysis. And it's different than putting in curb openings or highways. And I feel like the flea at the end of the tail of the dog here, because what I'm afraid of is, I hear Medicaid's so big, yet I've been working in laboratory medicine for 20 years and surgery for that. And I can tell you, in my world, Medicaid is the most inefficient, the worst paying, the largest loss leader. So I wonder how do the feds enforce effectiveness from the states they've coerced? How do the providers use the legal system? And since this is, I'm sorry?
You hadn't heard? They're very effective.
They
tell you that.
I've been before your court before, actually, and you always do solve my problems. Thank you, Your Honor. But it is. What I love about being part of Federalist Society, about not being a lawyer, is this type of discussion. And but in different industries, especially medicine, I feel like we are in a grand experiment that's going to really hurt people that are sick, that don't know about this, and and how is that going to work other than, so going back to theory, how do we hold the states hold the feds accountable, or the feds hold the state accountable for the money they give if we don't have any sense of measuring effectiveness and work, when you're talking about health, not my highway?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, so I think we can have a robust debate about what effectiveness means in this or any other context, and I think people would have lots of different disagreements about it. But you know, I would say there is, I mean, a lot of people would agree that A, there ought to be ways of measuring effectiveness, and they ought to be prioritized in how money is spent. But B, that once we start to put effectiveness measures into legislation, that often is the most controversial place that folks who are contending on opposite sides of the legislation will focus. Healthcare, a prime example of that. So the question is there some better way than having our political process with its flaws work that out? And from my perspective, although I don't necessarily like all the outcomes all the time, I don't think there's a better place. But I think we're having a constitutional discussion right now. You could have a very interesting regulatory discussion about how to structure regulation or structure non-regulation, structure pulling back regulation in order to achieve effectiveness. I'm not sure we're the experts on that.
Well, that's sort of my point in general about the whole situation of healthcare. Thank you.
John Roll at Constitution.org. Thanks, Michael, for your trial balloon hinting at a possible specific solution, which is always in short supply in these events. But for you and for Lynn, what do you think about pushing for a constitutional amendment pursuant to the doctrine laid forth in Madison in his veto message to Congress that Congress has no authority to spend money not pursuant to an enumerated power?
I've actually written about that. The reason why that amendment will never pass, I've written indirectly about that. Right now, as many in this room will understand, the federal government is a massive engine of redistribution. And the amendment can't pass because if we were to follow the current amendment process, we can identify very readily the states for whom it's a net welfare gain in terms of actual dollars, the redistribution to them through the federal government. And so, but for that not insignificant practical difficulty of getting such an amendment passed, I think it's a nifty idea. I would add that that's part of the reason why I firmly believe that the courts are the ones that have to take on these issues. The political process is not only flawed in some of the ways that Michael so entertainingly pointed out, but it's also the case that our ability to effectively use the amendment process is at this point in time severely constrained because of what the federal Leviathan has become.
Yeah, I had a question, kind of touching on this issue of political versus judicial solutions that we seem to be kind of continuing on. I know the first panel that was here, there was a gentleman who suggested something about abolishing the Internal Revenue Service. While not entirely practical, I was interested in the last speaker's suggestion of having this kind of rebate, partial rebate for opting out. I was wondering how we could effectuate something like that and whether or not you think that that would be effective in reining in the Leviathan. Would you have a checkbox on one or two departments that you do not want to fund on your 1040 form or something like that? What possible solution would that present from a political perspective, and would that at all pass a judicial review, as many of us, I think, view the problem of the federal Leviathan being both revenue generation and revenue direction?
I'm not sure how it would play out in real life, and the reason why I'm saying this is Lynn just mentioned this. For some states, the calculus, the in-out calculus, is extremely favorable, right? So if you said to, let's say, New Mexico, hey, if you don't participate in Medicaid, your top earners get 8% of their income tax, that doesn't mean anything to them because there are no millionaires in New Mexico, right? And on the other hand, there are tons of people. I mean, it's a big transfer state. It's a state outside Alaska. It's the biggest net positive transfer state. Other states would be in a very different position, right? The reason why I sort of floated this proposal in the first place is that these programs are surrounded by so many sort of misrepresentations and half-truths. You know, these governors running around, you know, we're leaving money on the table for distribution to others as if the state paid this in the first place, you know, all that kind of jazz. I'm desperately looking for a way to squeeze that out of the system and to have a little more sort of candid debate about it. How it would work out sort of practically, no, the decision to opt in or out would have to be made as it is now by whoever in state government is responsible for these things, and states operate these in somewhat different ways. And then the net effect would be on the citizens, taxpayers, and their 1040s.
Let me just say, we'll take about 5 more minutes since we started a few minutes late, but I read parts of Sam's article before coming here, and it is a very thoughtful exposition of the opinion. But my initial reaction from my years on the bench was that I do not see this case having much more practical significance than, I am extremely sorry to say, the famous Lopez case did. Because when Lopez was passed, there was hemming and hawing from the odd new advocates of judicial restraint on the left. Oh my God, we're going to have the courts interfering with the Commerce Clause. How dare they get into regulation? We killed that off after Caroline Products. How dare they? And in fact, their prediction was totally correct, because Lopez never had any effective legs in the federal court, and some of us tried to give it some legs. So it seems to me, I mean, just skeptical that the criteria set out in NFIB, whether you take them solely in terms of coercion or you take them in a more nuanced approach that Professor Bagenstos mentioned in his article, I'm not sure that they're effective, and I have to say, realistically, they would pose a very difficult challenge for a judge. Just as we should not be arbitrating issues of intimate personal relations that ought to be left in the political process, we should not be telling Congress where to spend and how to micromanage every penny that it spends. That's a very difficult call. So, any comments about that? Or where do you see future challenges coming from if they're going to get to
I think that's a great question. And obviously the history of this is yet to be written, because we don't know what all the challenges will be. I do think in the last section of the article that I wrote, I do talk about a number of places where we might see challenges based on NFIB, and I think that actually, I predict that if courts are faithful to what the Chief Justice said, there are likely to be few instances where those challenges will be successful. So it's very consistent with what Judge Jones says. The most difficult statute, I think, to justify, given NFIB, is the part of the Clean Air Act that takes away, potentially has an option for EPA to direct the taking away of all federal highway funds, potentially from a state, for violation of the Clean Air Act, even if the violation has nothing to do with traffic on the highways. I think, actually, theoretically, that's a very difficult case, and that's a case that would pose very serious questions. As a practical matter, EPA has never taken away all the state's federal highway funds for violating the Clean Air Act, so I don't think that case is likely to come up, but the statute sits there and at least has a potentially unconstitutional application, theoretically. Otherwise, and so Judge Jones talked about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. There's a whole series of civil rights statutes that impose conditions on federal funds. I wouldn't be surprised to see the NFIB arguments made in that context. I think that those are unlikely ultimately to prevail, but we'll see. I mean, this is a history that's yet to be written. Should Congress make significant changes to a statute like Medicaid again, or No Child Left Behind, the big ticket transfer statutes to states, I think, again, there might be states that find the conditions coercive and will litigate that. I mean, so I think those are the areas where you're likely to see issues come up. I tend to agree with Judge Jones's prediction about where the law will go.
2 more questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Douglas, and I'm from Stanford Law School. My question is primarily for Mr. Greaves, but would love to hear the thoughts of the other panelists on the question as well. In light of the pressures that state governments, or maybe the incentives that state governments receive in terms of actually wanting the federal money, what do you think would be the best way to persuade state voters and state legislators to actually give up on these kinds of programs without there first being some type of federal law enacted?
Right, Bart.
Okay, so I don't know what that even means, so.
Oh,
I'm acknowledging.
you don't know who Andrew Breitbart was?
Oh, sure, the internet guy, okay.
I mean, if you reveal, that's not entirely. What I'm thinking of is the Medicare fraud cases that the government has been pursuing with a little bit of alacrity in the last few years, and the shamelessness of what some of these people do is just beyond belief. And if somebody just showed how much fraud there is in a lot of these programs, it would be enough to make tax. I mean, the ultimate coercion on our government is going to be Moody's, the rating service. You know, you can't print money forever, and China's not buying our debt anymore. You just can't do this forever. So the taxpayers may realize this when their taxes start to skyrocket, and also when they see just how much money is wasted. But I'm sorry.
No, I think I entirely agree with Judge Jones on this score. Look, it's very, very difficult. There are some sort of straws in the wind that you can point to, that people may be sort of getting a little more, long-term oriented and wiser to it. So the high-speed trains, right? Those were grants under the stimulus funds, and a lot of states, I mean several, not a lot, several states